Former Prime Minister John Howard has defended the achievements of his government following an attack by Kevin Rudd. The Prime Minister accused the coalition of a fundamental failure of economic reform. But Mr Howard says those remarks lift political mendacity to a new level. Mr Howard was speaking in a special interview with Sky News chief political reporter Kieran Gilbert.
Mr Howard, thanks for your time. Your successor has questioned your legacy of reform in government. What's your response?
Well, I think he's demeaning himself. The fact is that I handed over to Mr Rudd the strongest performing economy in the Western world. The principal reason why Australia has so far avoided the worst impact of the global financial plunge is that Peter Costello and I handed over an economy which was in robust surplus, and we had a set of supervisory principles governing the banking system that even Julia Gillard has admitted was world class. For him to turn around now and say that we were indolent, we did nothing, and we weren't responsible for any reforms is lifting political mendacity to a new level.
Beyond the fiscal strength of the economy, what were the other major reforms of your government?
Well, we reformed the taxation system in the face of tenacious opposition. Mr Rudd called it a day of fundamental injustice when the GST started. The Labor Party, having supported the privatisation of Qantas and the Commonwealth Bank and asked us to support it as well to get it through the Senate, then opposed the privatisation of Telstra. They opposed all of our industrial relations changes. When we were in opposition, we supported sensible things that were done by the Hawke and Keating government, such as dismantling tariffs and continuing the process of deregulating the financial system. You see, Kevin Rudd has got this rather peculiar problem. He's begging for an end to the history wars, but he's restarting them this time on his own terms. And his own terms are flawed, they are partisan, and they completely ignore the facts of history. This economy of ours entered the challenge of the financial plunge in better shape than any other economy in the Western world. And that was overwhelmingly due not to the strong fiscal condition that existed when I ceased being Prime Minister, but also to 25 to 30 years of reform to which both sides of politics have made a contribution. And I've always acknowledged that. When I was Prime Minister, I always acknowledged the good things that Hawke and Keating had done in relation to tariffs and the financial system, something that Kevin Rudd is, it seems he's sort of pathologically incapable of doing in relation to things that we did. Now, I think in adopting an attitude, he diminishes himself rather than the Liberal and National parties.
In an opinion piece responding to Kevin Rudd's comments, you said Australia needed 5 major economic reforms at the start of the 1980s. The 5th one is a freer labour market. So you would argue that Kevin Rudd is actually taking the reform process backwards.
Oh, no. What, in relation to the labour market, for the first time in a generation, a major economic reform is being reversed. And he is actually taking the labour market back to where it was in the late 1980s. In fact, he's even taking it back to a rigidity that was in a small measure removed by the Keating government. So for the first time in a generation, we have a government that is reversing a major economic reform. Now, it'll be a while before the adverse consequences of this show up, but they will show up, and the Australian economy will pay a price for this overturning of one of those 5 great reforms that were clearly needed and which were implemented with contributions from both sides of politics.
So you're suggesting Kevin Rudd is guilty of what he's accusing you of?
Well, I would argue that he's done very, very little by way of further reform. I'm struggling to find any major reform that he's introduced, but I'd also argue that he not only has dishonestly denied our role in the reform process, but I'd also argue very, very strongly that he's reversing a reform which has been an important element in the economic strength that we now have.
So in light of the Prime Minister's recent statements, what do you make of Kevin Rudd's recent comments and call for an end to the history wars?
Well, look, generally speaking, we should always debate our history. I mean, my view about Australian history is that it is overwhelmingly a very positive story. That doesn't mean to say there weren't a lot of blemishes, there weren't mistakes made. It doesn't mean to say we treated the Indigenous people as well as we should have. I've always acknowledged that there are pluses and minuses, but whereas some people who belong, in my view, to the black armband view of history take the attitude that overwhelmingly it's a litany of shame and racism and sexism and all sorts of other isms, I take the view that it's an inspiring story of courage and achievement, with blemishes that we must acknowledge and blemishes that we should try to eradicate the consequences of in our current day society. But I'm an optimist. I take the view that it's been a great story, not a perfect story, but a great one.
One final question, Mr Howard, and it relates to your suggestion that Kevin Rudd has diminished himself. Would you caution him against these sorts of partisan attacks against his predecessors?
Oh, well, look, I don't think he'd ever take any advice from me, and that's fair enough. But I think Australians understand that both sides of politics have people who try and do good things for the country. And if you want to be objective and you want to be believed and you want to be credible, from time to time you've got to acknowledge that the other bloke may have done something that was good, while obviously sticking up for what your people have done. Now, I just say to Mr Rudd again, this country is surviving the worst impact of the global financial plunge overwhelmingly because of the condition in which he found the Australian economy when he became Prime Minister. Now, that was in turn due to the work of my government and also the legacy of a quarter of a century of economic reform to which both the Labor and Liberal and National parties had contributed. Now, they are the facts. Most Australians believe that. I think Mr Rudd should accept it.
Mr Howard, appreciate your time. Thanks.
Thank you.